I wasn't always a believer in inherited pain. I liked numbers, baselines, the respectable curve of a normal distribution, not the bruised poetry of memory running through blood. When the memo came from St. Halstead's administrative wing assigning me to Echo Unit, I told myself it was a career step. More data, more funding, better publications. The unit sat apart from the main hospital, a sealed corridor made of glass and soundproofing and military-grade doors. The first morning I walked in, the air felt ionized, like the hospital was a thunderhead about to break. They made me leave my phone in a locker, issued me a slate-gray badge with Echo stamped where a name should have been, and walked me through a protocol briefing that sounded like it had been written by a lawyer with a stopwatch. I signed a non-disclosure that might as well have been a confession, then followed the strip of yellow tape to control. Through the monitors, the ward looked like a laboratory brochure, white tile, rounded edges, soft lights, tuned to circadian rhythm. It was cleaner than any ward I'd ever worked on, and yet everything about it suggested we were preparing for a mess that couldn't be mopped. The program itself felt simple when it lived on slides. We called the compound Retrosyn. On paper, it was a reversible epigenetic modulator. It loosened chromatin histones associated with trauma-linked gene expression, while our DBS array provided targeted stimulation to memory circuits, hippocampus, amygdala, anterior cingulate, under anesthesia light, enough to keep the patient near the surface. Like lifting the lid, Dr. Newman said in our first meeting, tapping the top of her skull with a pen. We give them access to what's already there and guide the retrieval, a controlled burn. We would be recording every measurable thing: galvanic skin response, heart rate variability, saccades, micro-expressions, field potentials, a room full of machines to prove we were scientists, not grave robbers. My first week was intake and screening. I read files until the print swam. Veterans, abuse survivors, people with gaps in their lives that swallowed entire years, patient numbers instead of names, every past smoothed into a clinical arc. We calibrated the DBS for each case, ran mock sessions, practiced our scripts, everything ritualized. The nurse's hand on the shoulder, the moderator's low voice, the phrase we used if a patient dissociated. Anchor to now. The first 3 trials were ordinary in the way that keeps a career alive. Patient 07 recalled a car crash with crisp detail, and after the flood came the trembling relief of someone who had finally said the worst thing out loud. Patient 02 relived a riot from 2 summers ago, but came back to baseline within an hour. Anger draining like color from a photo. Nobody screamed. No one saw God. I began to believe in the slides. Day 6 changed me. Patient 23 had been in the system since adolescence, a woman whose file was more redaction than text mute by history, not anatomy. Foster homes, brief stints with strangers who called themselves family, then a long inland drift through institutions until she washed against our ward with a diagnosis that read like a shrug: unspecified dissociative disorder. She drew pictures of houses with no doors. Her intake EEGA hummed with the placid noise of someone who had learned to hide. She sat on the gurney in Bay C, legs tucked under the blanket, eyes tracking the IV line as if it were a river she might fall into. Neumann ran the pre-session checklist. I monitored the feed with a tech named Reese, who chewed on the end of his hoodie drawstring when he was nervous. We dosed Retrosyn at 0.5 milligrams per kilogram, ramped the stimulation in smooth increments, and watched the digital overlays march in tidy lines. Anchor to now. the moderator said when her breathing hitched. "You're safe. The year is 2025. You're at St. Halstead?" She blinked, her heart rate leveled. The machines purred their approval. Then she spoke. "At first I thought it was glossolalia, that babble you hear in seizure auras or the worst edges of mania, rhythms without meaning. But the syllables nodded, settled, and became words that felt like they'd survived a long winter. The voice did not belong to the woman on the gurney. It came from a depth where vowels felt heavier. "Fadir, forgive us. Ich nam the fire to him that coth not be cleansed." Reese stopped chewing. "Is that?" Neumann's eyes flicked to me. "Record. Get this down." The moderator tried to redirect. Patient 23 didn't look at her. Her gaze fixed on some point over my shoulder, past the ceiling. She spoke for 6 uninterrupted minutes, her mouth dry, the sound scraping like they had traveled a long way. Names spilled out: Elin, Tom, Brid, followed by a litany of tasks: digging pits, stacking timber, nailing doors shut for God's mercy. The word pestilence appeared in her mouth like an accusation. When the moderator asked for a date, patient 23 said, in that deep old cadence, "In the 22nd year of King Edward his reign," and began to describe smoke. I don't know when I realized I'd stopped breathing. The room had narrowed to a tunnel. Her face, the sound, my pulse in my ears. When it was over, she folded in on herself as if the air had found her too heavy to hold. We stabilized her, put her under the soft blanket, recorded our observations in the language of restraint. Neumann called linguistics. We all pretended we weren't shaking. The expert from UVA called back the next day, a woman with the voice of someone who had stayed up all night happily solving a problem. "Middle English," she said. Delight barely contained Kentish dialect, 14th century. The phrasing is consistent with confessional literature, homiletic remnants mixed with vernacular. Where did you get this? I stared at the phone. I looked at patient 23 through the glass, sleeping like a child who had spent herself. "A dream," I said, and hung up. We were not equipped for wonder. Wonder breaks protocol, Neumann reminded us in the morning huddle. There are explanations before magic. Cryptomnesia tops the list. The patient could have absorbed period language from films, books, fragments heard in a foster home. "Suggestion blooms under authority," she said gently. "Group dynamics." We nodded. We made the list on the whiteboard because lists make fear orderly. But the ward had changed. The doors felt heavier. The corridor lights hummed sharper. When I washed my hands, the water ran cold even at the hot tap. Small things, easy to blame on the building, on maintenance, on my mood, little shifts that made me feel like an object dropped into a different solution. 2 days later, patient 11 woke during stage 2 and began to speak in a language our moderator didn't recognize. The consonants struck like flint, the vowels soft as river silt. He drew his hands together in an unfamiliar gesture and chanted something low. We flagged the clip for translation. The preliminary note came back, likely Algonquian family, phrasings consistent with funeral lamentation. My stomach dropped at funeral. I felt superstitious about words suddenly, as if they had mass. Patient 5 came next, a man whose calm had always felt studied. Under Retrosyn, he folded a spoon into a tool with slow care and began to notch the wall. 10 cuts. Pause. 10 cuts. "You don't have to do that," the moderator said, voice steady. He kept counting aloud, pitch flattening until it was barely sound. The security nurse stepped in, and I found myself raising a hand, not to stop the nurse, but to hold the moment still, to see what shape it would take if we didn't interfere. I lowered my hand. Procedure 1. We removed the spoon. Patient 5 wept openly, not in pain, but with the helplessness of someone dragged from the middle of a sentence in control. I reviewed the footage alone. I slowed the frames, watched the pupils widen and constrict like living things, tracked tremors along jawlines, learned the pauses between breaths like a lullaby. I wrote notes until they became a wall I could lean against. Every explanation we offered held for a minute and then broke like thin ice. I tried to be grateful for the minutes. On day 10, I left the ward for the first time in a week and drove into town for coffee that didn't taste like filters. The sky was ordinary blue. People idled at lights, argued amiably at crosswalks, carried bags of groceries, and lived in the cafe. I studied my reflection in the window and found nothing wrong with my face except that it seemed undecided, as if it had been made from memories of faces and hadn't settled on the exact arrangement. It was probably the fluorescent lighting. It is always the lighting until it isn't. Back in Echo, Neumann asked for my impressions for the DARPA interim report. "Keep it sober," she said, tapping her pen. "We are at the beginning. Our job is to not fall in love with the strange just because it is strange." "Understood," I said, and described our first 10 days in words that kept to the middle of the road. She looked relieved. I envied her. I didn't tell her about the dreams because they felt too small to matter or too large to survive saying. They had started after patient 23, quiet as weather. A field with low stone walls, the smell of smoke that wasn't from anything burning. A child's hand slipping out of mine as if I had forgotten how to hold. In the last one, I walked into a house with no door drawn on the picture and found one anyway. Inside, there were marks on the beams, 10 and 10 and 10, and a rope coil that looked like a question. I woke at my desk with my badge imprint pressed into my cheek and dirt under my fingernails. I washed my hands in the cold water and scrubbed until my knuckles burned. The mirror above the sink showed me a man whose eyes looked like they had been awake for a century. Before rounds, I checked the schedule. Patient 23 was up again. The moderator readied the script, the nurse prepped the line, Reese checked the cameras. Everything in place, ritual steadying tremor. I told myself what I had always told myself. We were lifting lids, letting steam out, returning heat to its source. Anchored to now, the moderator said as the stimulators hummed. Patient 23 opened her eyes. She looked at me and then past me to where the hall met the exit sign and began to whisper. It wasn't English, not at first. I felt the words before I knew them, the way you feel thunder in your ribs. She spoke, and some old place in me answered without consent. After, when the room was quiet and the machines returned to their polite music, I wrote the day's notes carefully, as if certainty could be built out of neat letters. When I finished, I closed my laptop and sat very still. The air felt ionized again, the storm above the roof deciding what to do. I told myself I would sleep that night. I told myself I would dream of nothing. I told myself many reasonable things, and the telling sounded like prayer. I told myself the dreams would pass if I starved them. No wine before bed, no screens after 10, no lingering in the ward when the lights shifted to night cycle. I made rules, and for 2 nights they held. On the third, I woke at my desk with crescent scratches along my forearm, as if a desperate hand had tried to climb out of me. There was grit under my nails, dark and fine. I swept it into a tissue and threw it away like evidence I wasn't ready to catalog. On the fourth morning, I reached into my coat pocket for a pen and found paper instead. A small square torn from a hospital incident pad, folded twice inside, a gallows in thick charcoal, the rope rendered with the unnecessary care of a person who knows the work in his fingers. I stared at it until the dust blurred to gray rain, then sealed it in an envelope and wrote "for file" in a neat hand I hoped looked unlike mine. The ward was turning into a chorus. When I walked the corridor, vitals murmured from behind doors in compatible rhythms, aligning like tides. We kept telling each other what we were seeing made sense. Memory returning in new costumes, stress responses dressed in antique languages, patients adjusting to a protocol that asked them to return to burning rooms and keep the window open. I believed it until the moments I couldn't. Patient 14 arrived in the first snow squall, a combat veteran who wore stillness like a uniform. He answered questions with precision, nodded when appropriate, held eye contact in exactly the way we teach in therapy. On intake, he added, unprompted, that he had come to fix a name that wouldn't leave his skull. If it's a memory, he said, I want it bled out. We started him on the lowest Retrosyn tier and set an observation window longer than standard. It felt prudent, like measuring twice before a cut. For 5 days, he remained a model subject, private and steady. On the 6th, during stage 2 stimulation, he opened his mouth and spoke a name with the absolute exactness of a ritual. Jacob Brevard. The syllables came apart slowly, then locked together like a handcuff. He repeated them as if they were a prayer or a password. The moderator tried to anchor him. He shook his head like a swimmer refusing a rope. Tell me what you remember, I said through the mic. Not mine, he answered softly. His. Who is he? Patient 14 pressed his teeth together, eyes unfocused, and began scraping at the wall with the lower incisors. The sound was obscene, the sort of sound you don't think walls can make. I signaled the nurse to restrain. He lifted a hand without looking at her and said, still calm, 10 and 10 and 10. He kept scraping until he bled, and when we finally pried him away, there was a name on the paint, ragged but legible, Brevard. We stabilized him, placed a bite guard, adjusted the protocol. I took the footage to control and watched it twice, then a third time without audio. The movements were too deliberate for seizure, too singular for simple suggestion. I ran the name through every database available to my access level. The returns were stubbornly empty, and then they weren't. A brittle digitization of a county ledger from 1723, a list of sentences and fines and one execution, the name spelled Brevard by a clerk whose hand shook. The charges read like a cutlass: treason, incitement, sacrilege. There was a line at the bottom in a different ink, as if the page had been picked up days later to add the thing that wouldn't stop ringing. Let this curse run through their blood. I printed the page and left it face down on my desk. In the reflection on the monitor, I looked composed, the way a man looks when he's practicing a composed look. I flipped the page and read the line again. I felt, not fear exactly, recognition. A key entering a door I did not remember locking. That week, the sentence traveled like a tune. Patient 03 said it in a whisper she claimed was a draft. Patient 21 muttered it in her sleep. Patient 08 wrote it on his arm in marker without understanding the words. 4 patients, 4 tones, same cadence laid over different pulses, like a song taught in a camp where no one meets. We told ourselves they had overheard each other. We told ourselves the paneling in the ward carried sound in ways we didn't understand. We told ourselves a great many reasonable things. I asked Neumann for a meeting and brought the ledger, the audio clips, the notation my hand made when I wasn't watching it. She listened with her head down, pen moving in small loops, the way she takes on grief by making it into a to-do list. When I finished, she tapped the paper and said, "We have to be careful with patterns, Henry. The mind stitches ghosts onto laundry when the wind blows. Confirm the linguistic overlap is real. Keep separate logs. We are not priests. We do not get to declare curses." "It's not just them," I said before I could fold the words back into my throat. She looked up. "You what?" I had been prepared to lie. My plan had been to place the ledger on the altar of her skepticism and let her sacrifice it to the god of data. Instead, I said, "I've been finding things. Drawings I don't remember making. Dirt. I'm having dreams that use me like I'm a room." She watched me for a long time. I thought she would tell me to go home, to sleep, to see one of our colleagues in the main building and submit to the same assessments we demand of patients. Instead, she set the pen down carefully and asked, "Do you really think you were assigned here?" I laughed because it was the only sound I could reach. "Admin called. The memo. The badge." "Do you remember your life before Echo?" she said, not as a question but as an incision. "Clearly enough to defend it." I opened my mouth and discovered I had inventory, not memory. A townhouse with a mattress on the floor because I never bought a frame. A terrarium with a snake I could not name. A coffee shop where the barista knew I took my drink black, but I could not picture her face. A university whose corridors I could navigate like a fever dream. And when I tried to place my office within the campus, a fog that swallowed hallways and left me holding a key without a door. "I remember enough," I said, and heard how thin it was. "Good," Neumann said, and stood. "Meeting done. Then get some sleep. Bring me confirmation on the language accounts. We don't move until we're sure we're not moving because we're scared." I walked a long way back to control and let the cameras fill the monitors. 8 rooms alive with small human tasks. Someone pressing fingertips to their own lips. Someone flat on their back, quietly counting on the air. Someone turning a plastic cup around and around as if polishing an invisible gem. I scrubbed through the week's footage, frame by frame, when the lights flickered at 3:12 each night, not because I believed, but because ritual is ballast. In one video, I caught myself in the reflection of Bay E's observation window, face pale in the fluorescence. For a breath, the eyes were wrong, too fixed, the alignment not quite mine. I replayed the second 5 times, and each time the wrongness thinned, like a trick of the light, learning to behave under scrutiny. I told myself the lens was distorting. I told myself fatigue is a liar. By Friday, the ward's chart favored words we hadn't used the month before: ancestral, transference, whispered content. The linguistics consultant confirmed the Middle English and underlined phrases that did not occur in modern media. The Algonquian fragments mapped to mourning songs no one teaches in hospitals. Patient 14 wrote "Jacob, Jacob, Jacob" on his sheets with powdered coffee, and then apologized as if he'd stained a friend's couch. When I asked him who Jacob was, he smiled without humor. a house guest. I started carrying the gallows drawing in my pocket like a worry stone. I told myself it was to remind me how suggestible I was, how easily my mind could falsify artifacts to serve a thesis. But some part of me, call it the part that builds fires where none are needed, liked the way the charcoal left a trace on my fingertips, a signature, proof that something had passed through. In the elevator that night, I turned to Reese and said, "Do you remember how I got here?" He looked at me as if I'd asked if the sun was an employee perk. "You were here when I started," he said, shrugging. "Neumann introduced you as staff. I figured you'd always been Echo." Always is a large word. I nodded and stepped into the parking lot where snow had begun to erase edges. In the car, I sat without turning the key, watching my breath thicken the windshield, and tried to remember the exact day I arrived in Virginia, the flight, the ride, the first night in the townhouse. A calendar appeared, neat as a report, but the days felt like tiles someone else had laid. I went back upstairs. At 1:10, the ward was quieter than sleep. The night nurse hummed tunelessly as she checked a drip. I took the ledger page from my desk and ran my finger under the curse, the way a child is taught to read. The ink wavered. I thought about the architecture of transmission, how a sentence can move through centuries because someone's mouth loved the shape of it, because someone's anger needed a home, because blood remembers what minds are paid to forget. I told myself stories about contagion that did not require spirits and found that every one of them still required a host. At 2:47, patient 21 sat bolt upright and, without prompting, spoke the line in a voice that did not belong to her throat. The monitor ticked her heart into a gallop and then steadied. She lay back down like a puppet let go. I wrote the exact minute into the log, and then, for the first time since the program began, wrote something that wasn't a measurement. We are not alone in here. In the morning meeting, I didn't mention the sentence. I didn't mention the mirror. I presented a sober summary of a week full of unusually consistent content and recommended procedural humility. Lower doses, longer intervals, more anchors, fewer night sessions. Neumann agreed to the intervals and denied the anchors, worried they were becoming a crutch. We compromised on a script modification. In government work, compromise is a kind of prayer. Before rounds, I went to the bathroom with the cold tap and scrubbed at the charcoal that no longer came off, the little gray register in the fingerprint ridges. I looked up and held my own gaze until my eyes watered. "Do you really think you were assigned here?" I said to the mirror, and tried to remember anything vivid from the life I was defending. The sound of my snake on dry bark, the curve of my mother's lip when she said my name, the room I used to sleep in before the townhouse. I found a handful of intact moments and more fog. Down the hall, the doors clicked as the morning cycle unlocked. Somewhere, a patient began to hum a tune whose name I did not know and still knew it braided with the HVAC and the quiet footsteps of the nurse and the soft hum of the stimulators ramping up for their first test pulse, making a single sound that felt like a long rope sliding through a gloved hand. I put the ledger away. I slipped the gallows into my coat. I walked toward Bay C, toward the day's first session, feeling the ward lean in, attentive and patient, as if it had been waiting to speak and had finally found a mouth. Section 3, Recovery. I started leaving myself notes the way people leave food for a stray cat they don't want to admit is theirs. They were small, polite things. Sleep, eat. Don't stay past 200. Don't look at the mirrors after midnight. They worked until the ward began to speak in the pauses between them. By then, the sentence was everywhere. A patient would stir and breathe it into the pillow. A voice would leak from the intercom, faint as static, and I'd hear the last 6 words as if they'd been written in the air, run through their blood. We closed doors tighter and sealed seams with tape that made the corridor look like a shipping crate. I pretended it helped. I pretended many things. The morning I asked for my personnel file, the admin clerk didn't meet my eyes. She typed for a long time and then said, "It's restricted, Dr. Voss." Her voice wore an apology she had practiced. I thanked her as if I had received something. I returned to Echo and sat in control until the screen swam. At 23:10, when the night nurse went to the vending machine, I used her credentials and a back door I should not have known to exist. The archive opened like a wound that had been waiting for a finger. I searched my name, and the system gave me nothing I could put my hand on. I searched the ward, the unit code, the earliest trials. The file tree branched into a redacted forest. There is always a place the redaction misses, a corner where the black bar slips. I found it under a misfiled scan labeled with a typo. A page appeared that should not have appeared. The header read, "Patient via 008. The intake date was 8 years ago. The diagnosis sat like a dare. Schizophrenia spectrum, dissociative fugue, identity instability. The clinical notes were covered in someone's careful, knowing hand, and my name in the treatment team list was absent. The thumbnail photo made my stomach drop through me. It was not a perfect match. No photo ever is, but it was my face the way a scar is still the body's skin. Shorter hair, younger, in the wrong places. Eyes looking past the camera at something neither before nor behind it. The caption under it was a single line. Subject displays exceptional compliance when given a role. I scrolled. There were notes about an experimental identity scaffold, a protocol for imprinting occupational routines on a vacant field. There were dosing logs for compounds whose names we never used on the floor. There was a memo to DARPA signed with my initials, arguing for the necessity of immersive professional narratives in trauma retrieval. The date stamped under it belonged to a year I did not remember owning. In a subfolder, someone had saved a grant proposal with a clean, ambitious title and a younger, cleaner version of my signature. I read the objectives and met myself before the storm. Measured, persuasive, more certain than any person should be about what the mind can survive. We were going to lift lids and let steam out. We were going to turn fire into light. We were going to publish. I don't know how long I sat with that man. He didn't look like a villain or a hero. He looked like a person who believed that if you chart a problem thoroughly enough, it will become obedient. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to shake him. I wanted to ask if he could please show me the exact door he walked through so I could find my way back out. I scrolled further, and the text dissolved into blocks of ink. Between them, a few sentences survived like teeth after a fire. Prototype subject entered staff narrative seamlessly. Subject requires periodic narrative reinforcement to prevent drift. Echo content overlaps with pre-contact ancestral material. See Appendix B. Appendix B was gone. In its place, a black bar the size of a grave. I printed the admission sheet for patient V008 and placed it beside my badge. The badge looked like a paddle in a child's game. When I picked it up, it felt heavier than plastic should be. As if something had added its weight, while I wasn't looking, I went to Neumann because I needed someone to say no. I needed a human voice to turn the archive into a trick of fatigue. She was in her office with the door open, writing in a notebook with the pen she uses when she chooses her words carefully. I put the prints on her desk. She read them without interrupting and didn't touch her pen again. "How long have you known?" I asked, and had to swallow to make the words manageable. "That I was admitted here?" She didn't look surprised. She looked tired in the way of someone who has rehearsed patience until it became body memory. "I knew you were part of the early cohort," she said. "Not at first. The record was sealed, I found out, when the narrative started to fray." "What narrative?" I said, even though both of us were listening to the answer in the room. She folded her hands. "The one that lets you walk through the door each morning. The one that lets you write notes and make rounds. The one that says you're a doctor and I'm your colleague, and this is a research program instead of a very delicate bridge over a very deep river." She glanced at the printout of my signature on the grant. "You built half of it, Henry. You just don't remember the scaffolding." If she had accused me, I might have argued. If she had comforted me, I might have collapsed. The calm was worse. It made me responsible for a thing I had been pretending was weather. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because telling you too soon would flatten you," she said. "Because every time we tried, you came back to work the next day as if you had never heard it. Because the only way through was to let the echo run until it said what it needed to say." She paused. "And because I'm not sure there's a way through at all." Somewhere down the corridor a tray fell. The metallic rattle carried like an argument through the thin bones of the building. We both flinched. Reflex belongs to older lives than offices. I picked up the paper with my photo and felt heat where my fingers pressed. It was the simplest piece of data I had. It was also the ugliest. "If I'm a patient," I said, "why am I wearing your badge?" She looked at my chest and then at my face. "Because the story holds when you hold it," she said softly. "Because the protocol needed someone who lived entirely inside an assignment. Because you volunteered." The room tilted. I reached for the desk, steadied, and found I had left a faint gray ghost where my hand had been. Charcoal, always the charcoal. My pocket knew before I did. I unfolded the small square and set the gallows drawing beside my face. The rope was shaded with the muscle memory of someone who had drawn rope before. The beams had the honesty of objects made by hands, not imaginations. I had brought it to myself from myself and pinned it to my day like a name tag. "I don't know how to leave this," I said. "There may not be a leaving," Norman said. "There's only finishing what's inside the room." I went back to control, because rooms have currents, and I didn't know where else to go. The cameras offered me small, contained worlds. Patient 14 slept with his hands tense, as if gripping something he had forgotten to drop. Patient 23's eyelids twitched portraits. Patient 5 had arranged his blanket into a shape that made sense only to him. The ward hummed. The machines made their polite music. In Bay C's window, my reflection wavered. My eyes were my eyes. Then they weren't. Then they were again. I stood there until the change lost its ability to frighten me. On the desk lay the ledger page, with "Let this curse run through their blood" in uneven ink. I slid it into the file with the intake photo and the grant proposal with my name on it. The folder was a mouth that would not close. The whispers began after the lights went to night cycle. They moved under the hum of the HVAC, braided into the beeps, the way a taut melody rides harmonics. It wasn't a language I could name. It was a pressure on the skin of thought, a crowd leaning toward a window. I put my palms on the desk to keep from swaying. The words rose, sorted, chose a voice, my own, and spoke from behind my teeth. Finish it. What? I said, and heard my voice like a bad actor's. What you began. What you've begun in rooms with no doors and fields with low walls and squares where the crowd waits for a show. End what you bound. Close what you opened. Return what you took. I saw it as a series of rooms stacked like vertebrae. A church with a bucket of sand that would not douse anything. A winter yard with a tree that had learned to bear a single heavy fruit. A square with a scaffold where people pressed bracelets into their hands to keep them from shaking. In each, a version of me was present, important or irrelevant. It didn't matter. In each, the rope moved through his fingers as if it had been born there. I stood. I left the control room with the folder under my arm. I walked the corridor and felt the doors breathe as I passed. I let myself into the storage room. Inside, the smell of dust and plastic and old soap. On the shelf, coiled hemp that maintenance used for everything, mundane tools for ordinary work, too easily tipped toward ceremony. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Its existence was enough to fill the room. Anchored her now, I said into the air, the way the moderator does when she is calling someone back to the present year 2025, St. Halstead Psychiatric Research Institute Echo Unit. The words landed like coins on water and sank. The whispers rose to cover them. I sat on the floor with my back to the wall and opened the folder in my lap. The intake photo watched me with a patience I had not earned. I wrote on the back of it with a marker stolen from a status board. I wrote for the person who would sign the next grant, and the one after that, and the one who would turn the key in the staff locker and wear a badge stamped Echo instead of a name. You are going to think the work is the only way through. You are going to build a bridge out of yourself. It will hold until it asks for more wood. It will ask and ask until there is no you left to give. If you reach this page, leave before you can explain why. If you cannot leave, then end the story cleanly. Do not let it leak into the people who did not choose it. I turned the photo back over. I touched the face and felt nothing. No tenderness, no hatred, only the faintest recognition a person feels for a house he once drove past every day. I imagined stepping into Bay C and telling patient 23 a new script. I imagined lifting lids and letting steam out and watching the fire behave. The images were old. They had been used up. In the hall, shoes squeaked. Neumann's, careful and fast. She stopped at the door and did not come in. "Henry," she said, "don't make the ward decide." I closed the folder. The whispers thinned as if listening. "How many times," I asked, "have I reached this night?" A pause, then the truth in her voice like a pulled tooth, enough that I stopped counting, because counting made it into a ritual. I stood. I left the rope on its shelf. I carried the folder back to control and set it on the desk. I pressed the intercom and listened to the soft hiss that means a room will hear you if you speak. I did not speak. I watched the patients breathe. I waited for the ward to tell me what it wanted. It did not. It only waited in return, a mirror held at a distance. I wrote the final notes of the day with the care people reserved for last letters. I wrote the time and the metrics and the lies we tell to keep a shape in the dark. At the end, I added a line, outside protocol. I was the patient and the doctor and the witness. There is no role left that will save me. I placed my badge beside the keyboard. It looked identical to every other badge. If you held it under the right light and at the exact angle, you could see where the heat of my hand had polished it a little more than most a useless distinction. A human one. At dawn, the corridor lights brightened by degrees. The building breathed. The day shift would arrive with coffees and elastic smiles. The patients would ask for cereal and later forget having eaten. The unit would move through its chores with the competence that makes horror survivable. A new hire would sign a form and be paired with a mentor and learn where the emergency exits were. And by lunch, the badge would tug on their collar with the weight of belonging. I left the folder open on the desk so that the intake photo faced the door. I wanted someone to see it and know the story didn't begin with them. I wanted that to matter. I walked to the observation window of Bay C and leaned my head against the glass. Patient 23 slept on her side like a person hiding from the morning. Her hand twitched and stilled. My breath fogged the pain and cleared, fogged and cleared, like a signal trying to decide if it wanted to be seen. "Anchor to now," I said one last time, and this time the words did not sink. They hung in the air between the glass and my mouth, heavy enough to hold. I tasted them, then let them go. When I turned away, the ward felt quiet in a way I hadn't felt since the first day. The clean quiet of a room before people give it a history. It would not last. Nothing clean does. But for a sliver of morning, the hallways were only hallways, and the machines only machines, and my name, whatever it was, did not matter. I picked up my coat. I left the badge on the desk. I walked out into the cold, and the door closed behind me with the ordinary click a door makes when a person leaves a room. Inside, the lights continued their cycle without hurry. In control, the intake photo watched the doorway. In the nurse's station, a clipboard waited for a signature. On the floor of Bay E, near the baseboard where dust collects, a small gray smear marked the place my hand had rested. Or some other versions, it would stay there until someone wiped it away. And then it would come back, faint and stubborn, like a thought that has decided to live. By noon, there was a new badge on the hook with a name printed crisp and hopeful beneath Echo. By evening, the patients were speaking to their ceilings again. By midnight, the ward had found its rhythm. The sentence would surface somewhere, as it always did. Someone would hear it and pretend it was just air moving through vents. Someone would be right, and someone would be wrong. I walked until the hospital was a smudge behind me. I waited for the whispers to gather and tell me what came next. They did not. The silence was not mercy and not punishment. It was only a silence, and I carried it the way a person carries a scar. Proof that something had happened and kept happening, whether or not he remembered the first wound.